basically, I came up playing shadow stuff in the school band. When I left school, I joined another band which had the guys that ended up buying the stage door, Ken Wright and Warren Tate. They were in that band, or at least Ken Wright was. And we just played instrumentals. And then the guy that taught me drums, John Clinton, he ran the school band. He must have somehow got onto Mike Rudd, and Mike was looking for a drummer, so I went along and did the audition and got the job. And it was basically a reception type band, in that the bass player, Compton Tottle, and Mike did a lot of harmony stuff, and there was a sax player and so on. And we did instrumentals and harmony vocals and stuff like that. And then it came to the end of the university year and the end of the, I suppose the function type year. And around about that time, of course the Beatles were already happening then, around about that time the Rolling Stones released an album. And Mike came over and he said, have a listen to this. I think in New Zealand we'd heard Not Fade Away on the radio. And anyway, the album came out and we sort of liked it. And from a guitarist's point of view, I think the blues is and R&B is quite an interesting style of music. For drums, the American blues wasn't that interesting. There was hardly any. Well, a lot of the blues didn't have drums in it. However, what the English bands were doing was pretty exciting, and so Mike said, well, I think we should play this sort of stuff. So we learnt some of the stuff. I'm not sure how the hell he got the gig at the King Bee, but all of a sudden we were playing there and we had to learn a whole lot of songs in that idiom. So we basically learnt the whole Rolling Stones album and anything else we could get our hands on. And then as a result of playing that stuff there, different people were attracted to the King Bee, and a couple of guys turned up one night and told us about Marvin Gaye and Otis Redding and Booker T and the MGs, and we got copies of the records, and then so a couple of English guys turned up and said, oh, we've got these records by the Downliner Sect and the Pretty Things, and so all of a sudden we had all these people just giving us all this repertoire. So I think one of the reasons that we did it, one was because we liked it, two because we wanted to be different, and it just sort of grew out of there. And we heard stories about different bands and live performance and what they did, so we thought, oh well, we can do that too, and that's how Swinging from the Rafters and all those sort of things came about. And so it was just a mixture of rhythm and blues, more of the English rhythm and blues, and party tricks, putting on a show, and basically that's what it was. But because when we went to Australia, we dropped all the party tricks, and Australia wanted Motown and Atlantic, Stax, that sort of stuff was very, very big in Melbourne. I'm not sure about Sydney, but probably. And I wanted to go more in that direction. Mike wanted to do more of the blues thing. And in retrospect, he was probably right, because the R&B thing had a sort of a short shelf life. That was because we really didn't see eye to eye about what we should do. Well, the obvious thing was to go off and form our own bands. But But it was sometime later that I just started to really love the blues, when a lot of the, because we had Hendrix doing it, a lot of the American bands in the 70s were doing it, and in the 80s I got more and more into the blues. Yeah, well, it was a surprise to me when I heard the recordings back many years later, and I went, and it sounded like punk to me. It had that sort of punk energy. So we weren't really authentic R&B or blues players, because I think that the showmanship element created, the edge. But as far as, like the stuff that the Shadows, they were, like Brian Bennett and Tony Meehan were very, very good drummers. And so that gave me a good grounding. By copying what they did, that gave me a really good grounding. And a lot of the things that they were doing were reusable. And of course there were new things. See, one thing I learnt, in the Shadows, the bass drum wasn't a real big thing, And I think in music generally, coming out of England up to the end of the Shadows period, the bass drum wasn't a real big deal. And if you listen to jazz, it's all in the hands, and then occasionally, you'll have, you might hear the bass drum come in on an accent. Whereas once the R&B and blues thing came in, you had boom, 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 boom. The bass drum was quite prominent in the music, and it was working with the bass to either locking in together or playing something completely different from each other, which was just sort of making a complex pattern. And I remember the hardest thing that I ever had to do was that thing I just sang, boom, 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 boom. That was so hard. That boom, boom, boom. That was easy. I could do that, but that was the because it worked. I think it works in it goes on the offbeat, you see, and I'd never really done anything on the offbeat. So I sat down, with my drumsticks on this table that I used to use. They didn't have practice pads in those days, and I was just used to bang on the table, and I tried to do it, and I found it really difficult. Went to bed that night, woke up in the morning and thought, I better try that thing again, and I could do it. So I must have worked on it in my sleep. And that was the start of syncopation for me. Now, syncopation became quite important as we evolved, and as blues and R&B and so on evolved. It was the syncopation and like if you listen to James Brown and stuff like that, it's all, a lot of stuff's on the offbeat, and so the Shadows stuff was, and music up until that stage, the emphasis was more on the onbeat. For instance, marching music is boom, boom, boom. It's all on the one, whereas black music was sort of so you've got this offbeat happening all the time. In fact, one of James Brown's sax players, Maceo Parker, his solos were pretty much all on the offbeat, which made him completely different to all the other sax players. So yeah, that was a big thing, and so I learnt that off Ringo Starr. There was some Beatles song that had that bass drum pattern in, Yeah, Ringo and Charlie Watts were absolutely excellent drummers. They weren't that flashy like Viv Prince and the Pretty Things, and like they weren't flashy like Keith Moon, but they're real solid, great players. I can't remember which band it was, but it was somebody. It could have been Jimmy Hill or
Mike Bujanek's band.
Yeah. He ended up playing drums while Viv did all his antics. So I would have liked to have seen him play more drums, but from a showman point of view, he was great. And and it was good. We got to talk to some of them, and it was great. But I've always enjoyed seeing, acts live. I got to see quite a lot. The Rolling Stones were very impressive live. Mick Jagger was just a great front man, and I think probably music to me when I first started out was much more about showmanship than the music. Most of my aunties and uncles were involved in the theatre and in musical comedy and stuff like that, and my grandmother always used to take me to see them, so I was probably much more into the show thing. Loved Elvis, and it wasn't until I watched those old movies back that he had a guitar around his neck, and I got my mother to buy me a guitar because I wanted to be like Elvis. But when you watch those movies, he doesn't really actually play the guitar. It was just part of it was just a prop for him. And so for Viv, the drums were just a bit of a prop for him to, do all his antics.
But by that stage, you were playing a fair few of their songs, eh? So that'd have been.
Well, they weren't their songs.
Well, no, that's the other thing, and I want to talk about that. Well, sorry, you were playing their version of other people's songs.
Yeah, because we hadn't actually discovered the original artist at that stage. And remember I said earlier that people would turn up at the King Bee or the stage door and they'd say, oh, look, come round to my place, I've got the original version of this and the original version of that, which, like, when it first started, was quite a surprise to us because we really thought we were doing the original versions. But, so it was a huge learning curve. All that music was out there. New Zealand had the Leave It Hit Parade with Selwyn Toogood. They played the top 5 from New Zealand, the top 5 from England, the top 5 from the USA, and that's about all you heard. And some older music like Under the Bridges of Paris with You and Magic Moments and, all these sort of pretty straight ahead artists out of the States, Eartha Kitt and what was his name, Mitch Mitchell and all these sort of people. So you just, living in New Zealand, you didn't know about this sort of stuff. And, there was an American girl that played us James Brown live at the Apollo, which was absolutely amazing. And that's how come we ended up doing I'll Go Crazy. When we started, we got really excited about the Rolling Stones and the Pretty Things and the Downliners Sect. And the Kinks were pretty good too. Their first album, that was pretty good. And then after that, we started discovering all the original artists, which broadened our repertoire. And the repertoire basically split into blues type R&B and pop type R&B. And they probably don't work too well together. We didn't know at the time. I think Mike had some sort of an idea, and but I think looking back, the pop R&B was more of a singer's thing, and the blues R&B was more of a musician's thing. And then as I became more of a musician, I tended to gravitate more towards that music. Whereas I would say in the chants, I was more of a showman, I was much more interested in the show rather than the music. Although I did love the music, but I I didn't fully understand what was going on. It wasn't until we went to Australia and I discovered what feel was. I was doing it, but I didn't actually understand it.
Like you'd have a bit of a fight with Mike or something, and then he'd sort of fall over or whatever and get taped. That's almost like a James Brown thing.
Yeah.
Did you guys hear about James Brown doing that, do you think? Or is that...
Yeah, well, the American girl she'd seen the show. She'd seen him at live and said, that towards the end he'd fall over and the guy'd come out with a cape and then he'd get up again and spring to life and all this sort of stuff. Yeah, so she was quite descriptive about that, So all these stories that we heard, we sort of involved them in our stage act. But I mean, back in those days, we didn't really know what we were doing. We just tried things and we were just basically having a good time. And I certainly didn't think that how many decades later is it, Jeff? 4 decades later, we'd be sitting here, and I'd be answering questions about it, because it was a short period of my life and a formative period of my life, but I didn't really think much about it, and I didn't realise that it had made such a big impression on a whole lot of people, and they really loved what we were doing. So it's funny. Yeah, we had a residency, and I also think that we were very passionate about what we were doing. We really put everything into it. It may have been the right thing, or it may have been the wrong thing, but we loved doing what we were doing, and I think that's probably part of anyone that's been successful. They were passionate about what they were doing. Dave Clark said he wouldn't go professional until they'd had 3 number ones, and they had 3 number ones. Well, you just didn't know in those days, really. But I had a great career out of music, and until really a few months ago, I've always made a very good living out of music, whether that be playing live or in the studio. I spent many years playing on jingles and albums and producing music for people and working on movies and soundtracks of movies, that sort of thing. So, I did have a great career. It was a bit shaky when we first went to Australia, and I had to send letters home saying, send me some money, and then of course we ended up getting jobs and stuff like that, but eventually we turned professional, and you could make a living out of it. The blues-based R&B and the pop-based R&B, when you put them into a set, you were basically doing 2 different things. So what Mike wanted to go down the blues route, I wanted to go down the pop route. Now, in Melbourne at the time, the pop R&B side was really happening. And it was on television in a television show called Commotion, where they used to have actors and dancers come in and mime to, River Deep Mountain High and I'm a Soul Man and all this sort of stuff. So they were actually miming all these R&B, pop R&B hits. And there wasn't really a huge market at that time for blues R&B. But that's what Mike wanted to do, so different members of the band got together and tried to put something together. So Neil and I formed a band with a couple of other guys. I just can't, I can remember the guitarist was Tubby, he was quite good. Mike was trying things with Matt was trying things with us, and in the end I think what I did was I went off and joined an already established band called Campact that were doing pop R&B. Mike went off and pretty sure joined the Party Machine, which evolved into, well, see, around about that time, LSD had come into the scene, and there were these, what was it called now? The something ballroom. And Mike was doing stuff like it wasn't the Indelible Mertzeps, but there were all these really sort of like acid type bands, and Mike was sort of involved in that scene. By that stage, I was actually working 6 nights a week in a cabaret outfit, making this fabulous money and backing all these Australian artists, which I didn't really enjoy that much, but the money was fabulous. And I was learning heaps of stuff, and I learned to read music, and it was a real good grounding for me going into the recording industry and in the jingle industry and films and stuff like that. So yeah, it played its part. So I couldn't really get to these gigs because by the time I finished at 2:30 in the morning, it was all over. The TF Much Ballroom, that's right, that was one of the things. So there was this fabulous stuff going on, and my head was there, but I couldn't get my body there because I was committed to doing this other thing. So many years later, Mike asked me to come and play in Spectrum, and at Spectrum play the blues, which was absolutely fantastic. And it was just a real pleasure to work together again. But yeah, that's basically what happened. There wasn't really any, as far as I can remember, it was just musical differences. The first Rolling Stones album, the first Pretty Things, first Downliners, Sect, and so on, they're all covers. They're all American, pretty much all American songs. And of course, Andrew Loog Oldham, who managed the Rolling Stones, apparently locked Keith and Mick in a hotel room and said, you're not coming out till you've written a song, because it's what you're doing is not sustainable. You can't just go on covering American songs. You've got to start creating your own thing, you know. And the Beatles were writing all their own songs. And we realised that, of course, we had to do it, but getting the time to do it. Now, that's, if we had stayed together in Australia, that probably would have evolved. We were quite capable of writing songs. It's just that we were having so much fun doing all these other songs. It was just much easier, you know. And as I said, like, the stage door and King Bee stuff was much more. The music was a vibe, but it was much more about putting on a show. And so, you know, we weren't a recording band as such. We made a few records and stuff, but all that was the stuff that, you know, like the La-Di-Das and the Split Ends and stuff like that did later on. That would have all evolved if we had have stayed together. What we were doing, I remember in Australia, was we were taking songs like Van Morrison's 1-2 Brown Eyes. We did a completely different version of it. So what was happening was we were finding material, and then we'd do our own version of it, and that's what was starting to evolve. The songwriting thing would have evolved, and as you know, Mike has ended up being a world famous songwriter, so that capacity was always there. I ended up writing bits and pieces and getting songs and movies and stuff like that, but it was never really that exciting for me, you know, writing songs. It just seemed like a hell of a lot of work. I don't think John Mayall did an album, but I know he did the single I'm Your Witch Doctor, and I used to import all the records from England. And we were already doing John Mayall's stuff off his Live at Cook's Cleek album. and Mike thought would be a good idea to do it as a single, and I was a bit relieved because I never thought that I've Been Loving You Too Long really reflected anything like it didn't reflect our live show. I don't really know why we did it as a record, because it was like just, I don't know, it wasn't a chance. Even though I loved the song. Anyway, I was quite relieved when Mike said, let's do I'm Your Witch Doctor as a single. And but I did read something that that compared the Chants version to the John Mayall version, and whoever the reviewer was preferred our version, even though John Mayall wrote it. So there you go. But I liked that record. That was a good record. We couldn't have done what we did. Basically, it's a Bo Diddley feel. So, you know, it's derivative of Bo Diddley. There are all these great American artists that they laid down different styles. And I'm Your Witch Doctor is Bo Diddley. That's where it comes from. James Brown laid down a particular thing. Booker T and the MGs they set up a particular genre of. In fact, if it hadn't been for Al Jackson opening his hi-hat, see, when you played drums, actually, no, that's not quite right. In the 30s or 40s, drummers started opening their hi-hats, okay, but you didn't really hear it in pop music. The hi-hat was closed, and then somebody opened their hi-hat, but then I remember listening to a Sam and Dave record called You Got Me Hummin', and at the end of the song Al Jackson plays boom, which is the first time I'd ever heard the disco beat. And so in the 70s that became boom, sped up just to around about 120 or more, and yeah, Al was the first guy to do it. Yeah, well, we just used to do research. You'd get New Music Express, I think it was called, or Melody Maker maybe also, and you just looked at the ads of the records that had come out, and you go, well, that looks interesting, and that's how we found out about them, the Fairies, I think they were called. I'm not sure how we found out about John Mayall. Could have been through an ad. But you see, I had a contact in Decca Records that used to send me the records. So I'd send them some New Zealand pound notes for the postage, and they'd send me the records. And then I got a letter saying, "Oh, we can't do it anymore, but try this mob." So then we were able to get not only Decca Records but EMI or any label. And we just used to research it in the trade mags and punt, you know. And I think pretty much 95% of what we bought was usable. So that's how we got our material. Plus, of course, people telling us about certain artists, but we knew nothing about all the American black artists until people introduced us to them by coming to the gigs, and then once we knew about them, of course, we could get back catalogue, and we were completely amazed that a lot of the Beatles' first album, and maybe the second album as well, had a lot of Motown stuff on it. When it was postulated that would we be interested in doing a gig, and I said yes, and sometimes I say yes to things, and then I think, oh, bugger, I wish I hadn't said yes. And I was sort of thinking that, and I was thinking, well, who's going to turn up? And I was very surprised because Al's Bar was completely packed. I was surprised that people still remembered and were still interested. And as it turned out, it was a great gig. We'd rehearsed, 3 or 4 days and relearnt all the material and stuff like that. But it wasn't until we walked on stage and we hit that first note and it just exploded and it went, and it was just like twice as dynamic as what we had done at rehearsal. And I thought that was good, but it was just an amazing gig. You look at each other and think, he's changed a bit, but basically everybody was pretty much the same. It was good. It was good getting together with everyone, and it was just like, I know 40 years had elapsed, but it didn't seem like that. It just seemed like we'd had a few weeks off and gone on a holiday for a few weeks and come back and started playing again. It was great. Yeah. Actually, I was thinking about this the other night. Not so much about the Battle of the Bands, but I had a pretty ratty drum kit. I think it was called an Olympic, made by Premier. It was pretty ratty. And then, of course, when we won the Battle of the Bands, one of the prizes was, it could have been £500 at Begg's music store. And so the guys gave that to me so I could buy a decent drum kit. When I got a Rogers drum kit with a Dynasonic snare. So that was pretty amazing. I remember Dinah Lee was there. Pretty sure Ray Columbus and the Invaders were there as well. Because I remember talking to Ray because he used to be the dancing partner of my auntie. When we did the Auckland gig, I forget what that was called, but when the Chants first got together, we did we did Christchurch, Elsbar, and then we did some venue in
the back of room.
Yeah,
it was a big.
And Ray and I were actually. He came up to me and he said, "Oh, how's Marie?" So they must have been there, and I can remember it was. Pete Hansen was playing at the time. I've got no idea what songs we played, but I do remember that all of a sudden Pete turned around and said drum solo, and of course I wasn't ready for it. And I've never been the sort of drummer that did drum solos. I didn't like doing drum solos because even though I was into the theatric thing, and they're probably a good idea for that, theatrical sort of thing, but they always struck me as being a bit boring. Just drums banging away. I mean, they must be exciting to watch for people and stuff like that, but drums are not particularly melodic. And I was always much more interested in melody than I was, and drums were just, I started on guitar, but drums were just, what do you call it, the vehicle that allowed me to be an entertainer. I would have been, probably if I had did it all again, I would have preferred to have been a singer out the front, except I haven't got such a great voice. We've got such a great singing voice, so it's probably better that I played an instrument. Probably would have picked guitar or keyboards rather than drums. Anyway, it just happened that I played drums, but I didn't particularly like drum solos because they weren't that melodic, there's not a lot of noise, and, they must be exciting for audiences. Yeah, so that was a bit of a surprise. I had to make up this drum solo on the spot. I got no idea what song it was that we were playing.
Must have been a good solo because you won. So.
Well, it may not have been the solo that caused us to win, but yeah, I probably just thrashed around. But of course, what would have been useful was prior to that, surfing music was really big, and that was quite vigorous. You had to do all this stuff on your tom-toms and real arm aching stuff. So that would have been, would have got me into shape for doing something like that. And nothing was mic'd up. So you had, from a drumming point of view, you had to play pretty hard to get above the amplifiers, and you really had to slam your bass drum, which came in handy when I started recording, because the harder you hit drums, the better they sound. There was a guy played with Max Merritt, and because it was so difficult to hear the bass drum in a live venue, he got this bass drum made where it was a normal bass drum, and then the shell was repeated again, and it had these sort of like the old cases had these sort of clips, so it just clipped the front on, and it sounded like a cannon. And now when we think back, it was ridiculous that nobody had thought, well, I mean, the singer's singing through a microphone. If you can't hear the bass drum, why don't we put a microphone on it? But nobody had thought about that. People were building these great big cannon-type bass drums so you could hear the bass drum, and yet all we needed to do was put a microphone on there, which somebody eventually came up with, and then you could have a normal drum kit again.